All right. So last week and this week, our goal was to look at the different strategies we have in policing that are more than just responding to calls for service, investigating crimes, and just responding to emergencies. So the two main ways that we have of actually doing something different with policing is either through community policing or through problem-oriented policing. Okay. So the reason why these things developed is because our society experienced a rapid increase in crime events, particularly very serious crimes like homicides, rapes, robberies, and this began around 1963, moving into the late 60s and early 70s. So the public was basically clamoring for the police to do something different. In conjunction with this, we also had the civil rights movement and very publicized instances of police brutality against civil rights protesters, as well as the Voting Rights Act, which gave protections to minority individuals across the states. So what this basically resulted in were two different ways in which the police could operate within a community. Okay. The first was community-oriented policing, okay? And this is a philosophy that argues that the police should be involved in the community. They have to take responsibility for what goes on there, okay? And through community-oriented policing, the key concept is that the citizens actually matter to the police. It's not about just the police solving crimes or responding to calls, but people should be happy with the type of policing they're receiving. And in many instances, the citizens rather, demanded that the police work with them rather than just be this isolated people just in the neighborhood observing everyone else. They wanted the police to be active in the community, to interact with them, and for the community to get to know the police officers that are working there. So this often took the form of asking the police department to establish things like foot patrol and bike patrol, to have citizen advisory boards, to establish neighborhood watch organizations, to actually decentralize the police organization, meaning instead of the police operating out of one building, each neighborhood would get its own smaller police department where citizens could come to report crimes or ask for police assistance or just have that presence in the neighborhood. Okay. The goal of community oriented policing is to engage with the community, with the actual overarching goal being that if the police department is engaged with the community is going to take a more active role in preventing crime. When we talk about things like collective efficacy and legal cynicism, something that might have been mentioned in your criminology classes or other policing classes, this is what we mean. Community policing is great at actually improving perceptions within the neighborhood. Okay, and it leads to what's called the co-production of crime prevention. So instead of the police just taking sole responsibility for driving crime rates down, this is where the community takes a more active role. They try to be aware of their surroundings, to engage with their neighbors, to prevent crime by addressing any kind of issue or weakness a lack of guardianship within a area or whatever. So it is a much more indirect effect, meaning that you can't just start community policing and then expect crime to go down. Community policing is established, then it affects the perceptions of the neighborhood, which then in turn lead to lower crime rates, okay? There are a couple of videos I've linked to the PowerPoint that you should have access to that can give you a better idea of the different philosophies behind community policing, as well as what it looks like in implementation. when we take a look at what community-oriented policing is good at, it's very, very good at improving perceptions of the police. It's also pretty decent at reducing residents' fear of crime. However, across studies going back to the 1970s, we don't have any evidence that says community-oriented policing is systematically better at reducing crime itself. Great at making people feel better about their neighborhood, feel safer, but not so much at actually reducing criminal behavior. All right? So when it comes to the individual officers and their experiences, this often takes the form of officers being trained on how to interact with the community in a procedurally just manner. This means that the officer, even if they're giving the citizen a bad outcome, the citizen is receiving a citation or they're being arrested, the officer's behavior during that encounter makes the citizen feel like their voice has been heard and that decision has been reached fairly, okay? When procedural justice is high, when perceptions of procedural justice is high within a community, the community's perceptions of law enforcement tend to increase. And this increase is stable even if there are high numbers of arrests or high numbers of stops within a neighborhood. If the community feels that the police are actively trying to help and that they are being fair and then they are listening to the citizens, then the police are seen as legitimate. However, there are some pretty serious downsides when community policing is implemented incorrectly. One of those is when it's implemented as a kind of broken windows style of community-oriented policing, okay? This is where instead of the police trying to co-produce crime prevention within a community, they are actively taking over the community and reinforcing social control by stopping everyone they see who is committing any act of deviance, be it jaywalking or panhandling or having expired license plates. Because under broken windows policing, they argue, or Wilson and Kelling in particular, the architects of broken windows policing, argue that criminal behavior is the result of disorder within the neighborhood, instances where the residents themselves don't know each other, they can't recognize who belongs in the neighborhood and who doesn't, as well as anonymity between the police and the residents. The police don't know who goes where, what social role each person fits in, and if they are an outsider to the neighborhood. What Broken Windows basically argues is that the police should take over all social control within a neighborhood. So from a sociological standpoint, we have informal social control and formal social control. Okay, so informal social control would be like instances where it's a social thing. You don't feel good about doing a behavior. So this would be something like littering, okay? There's a pretty heavy social stigma against someone dumping their McDonald's bag out on the street instead of putting it in a trash can. However, most people aren't going to say that person deserves a formal citation. However, the formal social control takes the form of any time the police actively get involved in a situation and that situation results in some kind of formal sanction, meaning a traffic ticket, a citation, an arrest, or a use of force. Okay? So when broken windows policing is implemented and the police take control of social control within an area, what that means is the police are replacing all instances of informal social control where what previously could have been accomplished with a comment or a look or people being shunned. It's now accomplished through formal means, meaning every time someone litters or jaywalks or is sitting on the stoop of their apartment building, instead of someone saying, hey, could you please move? The police are saying, okay, here's your $50 traffic ticket or your citation. Now don't do this again. You may have actually heard this being rebranded by the NYPD as stop and frisk policing. where the NYPD was basically going through neighborhoods looking for anyone who matched the description of a crime. And those descriptions were intentionally vague. A African-American male between the ages of 16 and 35 who is between 5 and 7 feet tall wearing jeans and a t-shirt. That would capture a vast majority of people within a diverse neighborhood. So when the police tried to do this, they ended up negatively affecting perceptions of the police. Residents in minority neighborhoods thought the police were being heavy-handed, they were being unjust, and it resulted in people not wanting to cooperate with the police, not wanting to call the police, not wanting to be witnesses in any criminal investigation. And it also did not lead to improvements in the crime rate. Crimes didn't really go down when stop and frisk was implemented, regardless of what some politicians like to say. Right? So when we take a look at community-oriented policing as a whole, it just has to be that the police are working with the community and they're not taking things over from them, okay? So instead of it being more police being deployed in the neighborhood, it is the police working with the community to solve a crime problem. That could be a neighborhood watch, that could be a advisory panel, that could be bringing residents in to meet with a police representative to talk about any issues they see in the neighborhood. But as we've discussed, community-oriented policing is not great at actually resolving any crime incident on its own. What actually is what's called problem-oriented policing. Okay. Around the same time as community-oriented policing, members of the policing community started to think about how the police could actually go about solving problems, okay? And what I mean by this is any specific issue that is recurring within a community that is causing some negative effect on the quality of life. It doesn't have to be explicitly crime. It could be just a traffic issue. It could be a emergency problem. People are calling 911 from this address all the time. Or that a traffic issue is cropping up because a bar is unintentionally facilitating DUI and alcohol-related offenses because they're over-serving someone, okay? So problem-oriented policing means focusing in on those problematic incidents, those patterns of incidents, and systematically addressing them. So for problem-oriented policing to work, you need a good relationship between the police, the citizens, as well as between the police and other relevant community agencies. This is where the police can cooperate with different agencies within a city or a state or even at the federal level, because you need the community member itself or the communities itself to report the problem and to identify different ways in which they want that problem handled and to offer any insight into how the problem is being handled after the implementation. And the police also need to recognize that they may not be the best agency for solving the problem. The police don't really have any jurisdiction on what happens in a private business. However, if it's, for instance, a bar, the police could talk to the county or state liquor board and say, look, can you put pressure on this bar? Because we're seeing a lot of DUI arrests from individuals who patronize this place. So maybe threaten their liquor license or ask them to put a drink maximum on any tab. So unlike community-oriented policing, the focus is typically on one single neighborhood or community level problem. It is not implemented systematically across a city, but it is something that is tailor-made to the specific issue it's having to deal with. So the roots of problem-oriented policing is that the goal here is trying to avoid what's known as means over ends syndrome. Apologize for the spelling error. What that means is the police should not focus on what they're doing, but what they're trying to accomplish, okay? So an example of means over ends syndrome is the quote I have right here. The number of burglaries in this precinct are going up. Go out and arrest more people. That's not addressing the actual problem. That's telling the police to do more of something that may not actually have an impact on reducing the number of burglaries. Okay. So this can also lead to unethical policing strategies, meaning if the police think that they will be rewarded by arresting more people or stopping more people or citing more people, then they will go out and do that and not put any more effort into actually solving the individual crime itself, or solving the crime problem rather. So problem-oriented policing first requires that the problem be defined with some level of specificity. Okay, so we're not worried about, for instance, all burglaries, but we're worried about a particular cluster of burglaries. For instance, burglaries of pawn shops that happen when the business is closed, or drug dealing at a particular neighborhood street corner. Okay, so when the problem is defined, then the police actually have to draw on their knowledge of how problems form and what can be addressed. So this is where your criminology training comes into play. You may have to draw on routine activities theory to figure out exactly what you can do to solve a problem. Okay, and once that's done, your goal should be to implement some level of response to that problem. Now, this does not have to be aimed at arresting people. In many instances, problem-oriented policing is aimed at preventing people from being arrested because you're preventing the crime itself. You're not trying to catch people, you're trying to keep them from committing a crime, okay? The easiest way to explain this is through what's called the SARA model. And those of you who've read anything by John Eck are probably pretty familiar with this. Okay, the SARA model starts by the police department or even the police officer trying to identify and prioritizing problems. So this means going back to precisely defining what they're considering to be a problem. At the next step, the analysis stage, the police officer has to research what is known about the problem. What are the particulars of the incident? When are they occurring? Where are they occurring? Who is likely involved? What is happening after this incident is completed? Are people fencing the stolen property? Are they the drug patrons? Are they consuming the drugs at the location? Are they going elsewhere? Are they victimizing other people in the area? And with this information, the police and a researcher possibly can develop solutions about solving that problem. You want to reduce the number of incidents that occur in this location. And the way you do that is through assessing whether or not you're successful. This might be where you may ask a researcher or a statistician to evaluate whether or not your response was actually successful. So the pros and cons of this, of not just problem-oriented policing, but of the SARA model itself, are, first things first, it is very simple for police to implement. It has a very regimented way of solving problems. And it also institutionalizes the process within the agency, meaning that once the SARA model is established within an agency, everyone's basically trained on it. Everyone knows how to do this, which means that it's always being done within an agency. And there have been some pretty significant studies that show that the SARA model is actually very effective at reducing problematic incidents. A meta-analysis, or what's called a study of studies, that have looked at what's been done with problem-oriented policing has found that it ranges between 11 to 15% reduction in incidents, in the number of incidents, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when you think about all the different types of responses and all the different types of problems that the police are trying to solve with this type of strategy, that's a pretty decent reduction in incidents. However, there are some pretty significant criticisms of problem-oriented policing. First, it doesn't do anything about the underlying conditions that are leading to that problem developing. For instance, it may resolve burglary incidents, but it doesn't resolve the high unemployment rate within the neighborhood that is causing people to resort to burglary. It's not addressing any systematic racism effects or any issues that are beyond the police's control. Additionally, problem-oriented policing can be fairly resource intensive. Sometimes when it comes to identifying problems, you need someone who is trained on how to analyze data. And unfortunately, a lot of people aren't trained to do that, particularly those who work as police officers. It's not something that they are trained on, and it's often something that people who want to be police officers don't think about when they're trying to develop their skill set. So it may require someone who is a full-time crime analyst, or it may require that the police department reaches out to a university or a nonprofit for help with this. So the problems that police have to address with problem-oriented policing don't actually have to be enforcement focused. Like I've said, the goal of problem-oriented policing is not to arrest people, but to prevent the problem from occurring. So what the police often do with this is they try to draw on situational crime prevention, meaning that they're trying to change how a potential offender or a motivated offender sees the incident itself and tries to limit different aspects of the situation to lead to that crime prevention. Okay, so this is often based in routine activities theory, where this theory says the crime occurs when a motivated offender encounters a vulnerable target in the absence of capable guardianship. Typically, this theory is not concerned with changing the number of motivated offenders within an area, but is focused on decreasing the vulnerable target, the vulnerability of the targets, as well as increasing the guardianship within a neighborhood. And this can take a variety of forms. For instance, you might have heard something like target hardening, where businesses may put in anti-robbery screens. Like if you've been in a gas station where they have glass paneling across the clerks, that's an anti-robbery screen. It's a bullet-resistant glass, so you can't really go in there and threaten a clerk to get someone to turn over any cash that's in the drawer. For instance, you may also look at reducing the rewards, meaning having, I think a good example here, disrupting markets. You may have all the pawn shops within a city have individuals who are wanting to pawn particular types of goods like jewelry and handguns and tools and expensive electronics, have to provide a driver's license and proof of address, so that individuals who would normally go to those pawn shops to sell something now know that they have to basically identify themselves and increase the likelihood that they will be caught. Okay, so these techniques I am not going to test you on. I just think that it's pretty useful information for people to know. And it's honestly kind of cool to think about all the different ways that businesses and residences can actually work to prevent any crimes from occurring. So what this means in practice is that the police do not have to rely on their ability to stop someone on the street, to potentially give them a citation, to arrest them, or to use force to solve a problem. The police can actually solve problems by just making small changes in how they work and how they think about these different types of incidents. All right. As with the community-oriented policing, I've linked some videos into the PowerPoint for you to take a look at if you'd like. However, it's up to you. I'm not going to test you on the content in there. I just think it's pretty interesting stuff to look at.